This is the fourth installment in our series on the Sermon on the Mount. Today we'll look at Matthew 5, verses 21 through 48, what I'm calling the But I Say to Yous. To understand this passage, you can think of it this way. There's this sort of black pit of things that are not good for society or for individuals that God does not want us to do and did not want the Hebrews to do. Remember, they're living in a land surrounded by people who did not know God and had lots of really bad practices. And sort of things in the pit that we shouldn't do are things like murder, adultery, lying, stealing. And so you can think of the Old Testament laws, think of things like the Ten Commandments, as this fence that God erects that says, don't step over this fence. The things on the other side of the fence are just things that are not good. Not good for individuals, not good for society. But just because we don't actually cross over this fence doesn't mean that we've actually reached the essence of what it means to be Christian or what it means to love God. But all these things are sort of around the fence that there may or may not be a specific law against, but are still not good. So maybe I didn't murder the guy, but I really resented him and wanted to. Maybe I didn't commit adultery, but I thought about it. Maybe I didn't actually lie, but I had my lawyer write up such complicated legal papers that I got what I wanted from the person. And maybe I didn't actually steal, but I got what I wanted because nobody could understand the deal, or maybe I didn't tell them some of the problems of what I was selling them. So in this passage, Jesus' teaching is saying, look, what we want to do is move toward God's will for us. We want to have mercy instead of resentment or murder. We want to be faithful instead of lusting or adultery. Truth instead of legalism or actually lying. Generosity is the goal instead of greed or stealing. And if you look at this passage in that light, it's a pretty obvious set of things that Jesus is trying to get across. So we begin with, you have heard that it was said to the people long ago, you shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. Now, you shall not murder is a commandment. It's in Exodus and other places in the Old Testament. And there are procedures in the law that the Hebrews received from Moses that describe how someone who commits murder shall be judged. What he's saying is that, you've heard, and actually it's there. He's not contradicting the commandment. He's saying that the intent of the law is not just about avoiding murder. Before you commit murder, you may have already stepped out of God's will. It says, but I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to a brother or sister, Raka, is answerable to the court. And anyone who says, you fool, will be in danger of the fire of hell. And notice this is talking about brother or sister, so we can think of that in terms of other Christians. And this thing about anger, the first thing that comes to mind, well, anger is emotion. I can't control my emotions. But Jesus is very specific. How do we handle this emotion? And anger in this verse has a sense, in the grammatical sense in Greek, of is being angry. Maybe the same as resenting or nursing a grudge. The root of the Greek word means to swell up. So think of swelling up with anger and holding it inside. And why is this wrong? This is wrong because of what it does to your relationship to God. In Ephesians it says, in your anger, do not sin. It doesn't say you can't be angry. It says, do not sin. Do not let the sun go down while you're still angry, and do not give the devil a foothold. So it's important of how you handle your anger. And clearly, he says that you start spewing out angry and hurtful words at your brothers and sisters is not a good idea. And this idea, raka, is a term of contempt. It means something like stupid or empty-headed. And fool can mean stupid, but especially in Proverbs, it can also mean anyone who's morally deficient. So he's saying, you're angry at your brother or your sister. Don't call them a stupid, empty-headed slut. That's not a good idea. And one of the first measures of our Christianness, if there is such a word, is how we interact with other Christians. If anyone considers himself religious and yet does not keep a tight rein on his tongue, he deceives himself and his religion is worthless, according to James. So what do? What's the positive action that we take? Therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled to them, then come and offer your gift. So he says pretty explicitly, if you have done something against your Christian brother or sister, go and make it right. But he also talks about people in general. He says, settle matters quickly with your adversary who's taking you to court. Do it while you are still together on the way, or your adversary may hand you over to the judge, and the judge may hand you over to the officer, and you may be thrown into prison. Truly I tell you, you will not get out until you have paid the last penny. And the summary of this is really work out your differences with people as quickly and as agreeably as you can. Don't pick the fight. Try to work it out so that it's a win for everyone when possible. Next, Jesus takes up adultery. You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. So again, there is a commandment, and the commandment is do not commit adultery. But Jesus says, not only should you not commit adultery, but sin starts before the physical action. In the sense of the Greek is looking upon a woman in order to lust after her. So what does he do? It says if your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. It's better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. Now I don't think that Jesus actually is talking about physically grabbing a stick and gouging out your eye. What he is saying is that what you spend your time looking at matters. And we have an example of that in our current culture. Pornography is a $97 billion industry worldwide. And therapists who treat porn addicts say they behave just like any other addict. So if you spend your time with pornography, it's going to affect the way you think about things, whether or not you're tempted toward adultery. It's not an edification to do this. It is not a Christian thing. He says, and if your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. And again, it's not just about cutting off your right hand. It says what you do before you commit adultery matters. And since we're talking about adultery, the assumption is that you're married. So in terms of what you do, stuff happens. I think everyone should have some list of ground rules for themselves. If you don't put yourself in compromising situations, you're less likely to do something that actually, you're going to regret. In some sense, you want to be public about how you interact with people, both male and female, in all situations. And if you're married, you want to work at maintaining the connection to your spouse. Physical, emotional, spiritual, intellectual, he or she should be your best friend, the person that you actually share your life with on all levels. Now, I also want to be careful with this because I think some Christians actually go a step beyond what Jesus means. So we're going to solve this problem by not interacting with the other gender at all. We're going to sit on different sides of the church. We're going to be in different clubs. We're not going to interact at all. And so I balance this with Jesus' attitude and the clear teaching, I think, in Genesis 1 that both genders should have equal access to opportunity. In a time when women were not taught, Jesus taught women. They sat at his feet when he was teaching. He healed women. He interacted with women. And so we have to be careful that, okay, you cannot be in my club because you're the wrong gender, but my club is where all the business decisions are made. We should have equal access to everyone to opportunities. And as a college professor, I deal with this every day. I have graduate students and research students. They're both male and female. And I want to make sure that each of them have exactly the same opportunities, the same amount of time with me, the same amount of advising with me, that they feel just as comfortable talking to me about the things that matter, uh, whether they're male or female. So I have to think hard about how I do this, but I think both are important. There's a reason why all my students know my wife and are at my home and know both of us together. Then he goes from adultery to divorce. It has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality makes her the victim of adultery. And anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Now, this is male to female because the wife really had no option to divorce her husband. And in Deuteronomy 24, it indicates that a Hebrew man could give his wife a certificate of divorce if she does something displeasing. But displeasing is not very well defined. It could be taken to mean, I find the way you do your hair displeasing, so I want a divorce. Our dinner tonight was really displeasing, so I'm going to divorce you. Here's the certificate. We're done. Jesus says that a casual attitude toward divorce was not God's intention at all. And I think we can assume that divorce is usually, not always, but usually wrong. This was brought up to Jesus by the Pharisees. So in Matthew 19, it tells this particular story. Some Pharisees came to him to test him. They said, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason? Haven't you read, he replied, that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female and said, for this reason a man will leave his mother and father and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. And in this, Jesus actually quoted from both Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, both versions of the creation story. Why then, they asked, did Moses command that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away? Jesus replied, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard, but it was not this way from the beginning. The intention of marriage was a lifetime commitment of love and companionship between man and woman. But we know that divorces happen. So as Christians, do we have guidelines of when is divorce allowed? And I'll suggest two. One comes straight out of this passage, and it's repeated in Matthew 19, that divorce could be allowed because of sexual immorality. Not God's will, but you're already out of God's will when this happens. And the other one that's usually accepted by Christians is abandonment by an unbelieving spouse. And this comes from what Paul says in 1 Corinthians. But if the unbeliever leaves, let it be so. The brother or sister is not bound in such circumstances. God has called us to live in peace. And most of the Christian church has usually understood this to include actions that force abandonment, spouse or child abuse, criminal acts, drug addiction, things where you are abandoned physically and emotionally, are no longer safe. Now we talk about truthfulness. Again, you have heard that it was said to the people long ago, do not break your oath, but fulfill to the Lord the vows you have made. But I tell you, do not swear an oath at all, either by heaven, where is God's throne, or by the earth, where it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot make even one hair white or black. All you need to say is simply yes or no. Anything beyond this comes from the evil one. So Jesus specifically addresses, when can you break your word? And the Jews of his day had very legalistic rules as to when your word had to be upheld. Examples in Matthew 23. Woe to you, blind guides! You say, if anyone swears by the temple, it means nothing. But anyone who swears by the gold of the temple is bound by that oath. You also say, if anyone swears by the altar, it means nothing. But anyone who swears by the gift on the altar is bound by the oath. Jesus says, forget all this legal stuff. It's yes or it's no. You always keep your word. You have heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. Now, an eye for an eye and tooth for tooth is actually in the Old Testament. It says, anyone who injures their neighbor is to be injured in the same manner. Fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. The one who is inflicted injury must suffer the same injury. Now, this sounds harsh, but you got to remember the context. The context is that if someone actually knocks out your tooth, you're not supposed to go and break both his legs and kill his firstborn son. The punishment should fit the crime. And the implementation of the punishment was not done by the victim. There was a court system, and the court had to decide who was guilty and what they were guilty of and what the punishment should be. And these were guidelines to make sure that the punishment fit the crime. Leviticus also says, do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against anyone among your people, but love your neighbors yourself. I am the Lord. And then Jesus says, but I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. If I summarize this passage, I would say it's something like, surprise the evil person with your response. So a slap is an insult. So the implication is someone insults you, don't slap them back. Don't insult them back. Surprise them. And if you look in Leviticus again, it says, if you take your neighbor's cloak or coat as a pledge, return it by sunset, because that cloak is the only covering your neighbor has. What else can they sleep in? When they cry out to me, I will hear, for I am compassionate. So this, if anyone wants to see you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. It says, you are not legally entitled to your neighbor's cloak. But we'll go ahead and do something beyond what the law requires. If anyone forced you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. The context was at the time of Jesus, a Roman soldier could commandeer a civilian to carry his luggage for 1 mile. But Jesus says, give them an extra mile. And then the last part is not necessarily an evil one. It's just repeating something that's all over the Old Testament. we'll look at Deuteronomy. It says, there will always be poor people in the land. Therefore, I command you to be open-handed towards your fellow Israelites who are poor and needy in your land. Give to the one who asks you. Do not turn away from the one who borrows from you. To be generous. Surprise people with who you are. You have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Now, what they heard is half right. Leviticus 19:18 says to love your neighbor, which would be your people, your family, countrymen, your tribe. And then later on in Leviticus 19, it says, also love the foreigners among you. Nowhere in the Old Testament have I been able to find the command to hate your enemy. It's just not there. It just goes beyond that. It says, but I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. If you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even the tax collectors doing that? And if you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than others? Do not even pagans do that? Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. So Jesus goes to the extreme of extending love even to enemies. And it's interesting that we can see some examples of that. So I'll pick two quotes. Martin Luther King Jr. says, love is the only force capable of transforming an enemy into a friend. Nelson Mandela says, if you want to make peace with your enemy, you have to work with your enemy. Then he becomes your partner. And I think as Christians, this may seem like a dubious way to treat your enemies, but we don't do it in a closed system. We do it in the context of a God who balances the scales and who actually uses, our gift of trying to be more loving to actually create a different situation from what we started with.